What is up, y'all? It's your boy Aniki coming at you with another video, and today I'm covering a topic that pops up every now and then in the fandom and definitely came up during the Bakugo discourse with the cluster shots. And that's right, today's topic is going to be Quirk Awakening. Now, before we even get into this video, I just want to make something very clear. This video will be about how Quirk Awakening isn't a real thing. That is to say that the way people see Quirk Awakening and the way it's lauded and it's been kind of depicted in the story, or the way Redestro's words made it sound, it's not some giant mystical thing that a lot of people interpret as. In fact, Quirk Awakening wasn't even introduced to us by Redestro, but rather what it actually is kind of covered all the way in the beginning of the series by All Might. Now, I know a lot of people are like, well, why would he bring Papa Horikoshi? Listen, just from jump, one of the main things that a lot of people don't properly do when discussing Quirk Awakening is contextualizing. And what I mean by this is that Quirk Awakening was introduced to us in My Villain Academia. We were given 3 examples of what Quirk Awakening is, and then with this latter half, and later on in the series, we've been given a 4th example that a lot of people thought was an example, and then they're like, oh, well, I guess that's not what it was. But we'll get there, because I'm going to explain how this works. So, first off, I'm going to use Toga, just like how, she was like the first example. We had, Curious even suggested that she had gone through an awakening. Now, this is one of the things that throws me off, is that Curious herself suggests that Toga, by being able to use Ochako's quirk, is having an awakening. And it's through her desperation to survive, etc., that she was able to do this. But not Ochako, but Toga actually says no to this idea and then focuses on escaping and handling it. And it's when we get to Ochako versus Toga during the Paranormal Liberation War where this is fully explained. Now, the way I look at what people see as awakening is not really so much a quirk awakening so much as characters understanding their quirks to the level of a JoJo's character or something like that, like the way that people view those kinds of powers like Stans or Nen. But let's look at Toga's case specifically. She becomes the people she loves. That's her thing. Her quirk allows her to take anyone's blood and become them, but it does not allow her, but its main goal is to make her the people she loves. Now, what does that mean, to become someone? If you're going to be them, you're going to walk like them, you're going to talk like them, you're going to look like them, you're going to be dressed like them. And in the case of My Hero Academia, you're going to fully assimilate and replicate everything about them. You see, a lot of people looked at Toga becoming someone as this very surface level, superficial oriented ability. Horikoshi took it as saying that she becomes you down to the DNA. Her quirk factor will replicate your quirk factor. Her quirk factor will replicate everything about you. Your DNA is a part of who you are. Your heritage, your future diabetes condition at the age of 40 because you just got that in your genes, your future, there's some early signs of this kind of cancer. All these different things are in your genetic factors, and all these things can come into play at different times in your life just based off your genetics, which means that your DNA is a part of who you are and your life experiences, hands down. So Toga and her quirk is to become someone, especially if it's someone she loves, narrowing down the pool of people she can become even further to make it a not busted quirk. I see what you did there, Horikoshi. Then it makes sense that if she's going to become them by consuming their genetic material, that she would replicate everything stored within the DNA and genetic material, which would also include the quirk factor. So when you look at it from that perspective, the question from the beginning of the series, when you look at a character like Toga, should not be, can she replicate somebody's quirk? But it would be, well, why wouldn't she be able to? She's copying their DNA to become them. So of course she would have access to their quirk. I wouldn't even be surprised if through more training, Toga was able to replicate anybody's quirk. And that easily could be a part of why she is, a 17-year-old, similar to how Momo was originally going to be an adult hero, and then she got kind of brought back down to being younger because an adult hero with lots of experience and a quirk like hers should really be prepared for pretty much anything, and thus wouldn't have as many issues or conflicts as she would have. So dropping her down and making her a student that has to learn and develop those powers seemed like the better move for the story in Horikoshi's mind, and I agree. So that's the Toga example. That was not an awakening. That was her utilizing her quirk in a way that we probably should have understood that her quirk could do from the moment we were introduced to it. Now, so that's one example of awakening not being awakening. 2, I'm going to skip the Gatan example, and instead I'm going to go over to Shigaraki because that one was even easier. We saw, Redestro was like, oh, his quirk should only allow him to decay the things he's directly touching. Redestro even throws an option in here. There's other Redestro curious. So they throw out an option where they basically say, was our information wrong? This right here was Horikoshi already giving you a way out intellectually to understand that, yes, they were able to research the league. Yes, they were able to do all this stuff. No, they did not have any data on their training. No, they did not go all the way back to Shigaraki's childhood, as they wouldn't have been able to, so they wouldn't have known about a decayed house. All of these factors, all this missing information that was missing from the story that we got would have allowed us to see that Shigaraki has always been able to propagate his decay. It's that he's been repressing it, and when he was at his most exhausted, his psychological barriers became less rigid, and that allowed for the proper utilization of his quirk to permeate, not a form of awakening. And the thing that confused him is that he just thought, oh wow, Shigaraki's physical prowess and stuff, but we know that Shigaraki was simply fighting Giganto Makia in fight or flight situation for, basically 2 months. So consistently, when given opportunities to actually have awakening, with those 2 times, the times in the story, awakening was dismissed. It was written off. It was like, no, this is not actually a thing. Even when you look at Sad Man's Parade and then the ability to also make clones of others in conjunction with making clones of yourself, people could see that as a form of awakening, especially when you think about how a lot of us saw Twice not being able to clone himself originally as a power restriction, only to find out that it was a psychological one. Both times during My Villain Academia, arguably even with Twice, you could argue that too is seen as an awakening. All of these are directly not tied to the quirk changing, but the mentality of the person or the position that they're in or their level of closeness and understanding of their quirk by the person, a psychological change that the wielder of the quirk has. So now we get an example like Bakugo's, who also further kind of debunks and gives like the closest thing to an awakening a lot of us are going to see. These next tier explosions, these moving beyond like a whole new level, and even being able to eventually get a game off of Deku and catch a Kachan with cluster for mobility, even with Deku being at 45% now, kind of screams volumes about how we don't need a mystical awakening to get quirks to the next level. We need a change in thought, which in of itself is also kind of a nod towards how the series is supposed to resolve some of its issues, not with some magical wishing away, but with actual thought process and handling the things and thinking things through and making plans going forward. But let's look at Bakugo's quirk awakening and what it ended up actually being. And what it ended up being was he was building up beads of sweat and effectively dispersing extra sweat and then detonating it. Detonating sweat with more sweat with explosions. It's effectively allowing him to have droplets of sweat detonate. And this is kind of why they always blow up in circles, because it's little droplets of sweat. As they get hit with the explosion, they immediately, in response to the heat, detonate, but they're not detonating at the point of his hand. They're detonating out in the air. So, and we even see him like consciously tossing the droplets towards Deku during the game of Catch a Kachan. And so we now know that like what he can do with Cluster is basically he has those things on his arms that pull in the sweat so they can fill up the gauntlet. And I'm guessing what he's doing is kind of just like waving those so that they disperse sweat and then detonating that sweat, allowing him to do cluster shots now. So not something that was the byproduct of his quirk evolving, but instead Bakugo focusing on not just the explosive aspect of his quirk, but the actual sweat aspect of his quirk. Because Bakugo's quirk isn't just making booms, it's specifically sweating a substance that is explosive and then the ability to additionally ignite that substance with his palms. Interestingly enough, this power-up was kind of foreshadowed by the first film, because during that movie, Shoto and Bakugo are fighting a character that can like scoop the air and then in the process will pull things to him. And while he's tearing holes through Shoto's ice, he ends up launching an attack at Bakugo. Now, the area attack that he launches at Bakugo is dodged, but it does rip Bakugo's sleeve and end up pulling some of his sweat towards the guy. And the guy ends up with some of that sweat in his palm or on him, and immediately Shoto switches from ice to fire and blows the guy up. Now, what's interesting about that though is that it means that already we had the idea of the sweat itself being tossed. And now, since Bakugo seems to have the ability to sweat almost at will in his palms, that kind of leads me to believe that his sweat glands somewhat work similar to venom sacs and certain species of snakes that can spit. And so I wouldn't even be surprised if the further step of this is him eventually kind of being able to just shoot out extra sweat on command and basically squirting sweat everywhere. Not exactly the coolest way of thinking of his power, but definitely very on the nose. And so it's kind of like Horikoshi has taken this moment to go out of his way to make it clear that his powers are integrated into the physiology of his people, not just a soft magic system like that is adjacent to them. So, in fact, if you've been following the channel for a while, one of the things that I've talked about regarding Bakugo and getting an explosive power up is that he has, because of his sweat, and that power up is always focused on the sweat, sweat is usually water, but in Bakugo's case, he sweats a nitroglycerin-like compound. It's important to note that his mother's quirk is glycerin sweat, and his father's quirk is acid, and it specifically is an acid that he can secrete from his hands, and with lots of friction detonate, or with high impacts detonate. So he would like rub his hands together and then slap, and that's kind of how that would work. So it's not actually nitroglycerin; it's just a similar substance made with a specific explosive acid, but what that also means is that going forward, because Bakugo has the ability to ignite, the next step in Bakugo's power scaling, if we want to get one more power up in, even ignoring like just getting better and more reliable with cluster, but if you want one more power up, then the next step would be for Bakugo not only to focus on sweat production like he has with these droplets for cluster, but to also focus on sweat purity and quality. So that would take his quirk another step forward. Having, for example, right now, let's just say if we had 1 ounce, and this is a very gross analogy, let's say we had a cup of Bakugo sweat. Yep, there's no way to make that sound normal. We're gonna say we have a cup of Bakugo sweat, and then we break it down to parts, and it turns out that when all is said and done, only 10% of Bakugo sweat is actually this nitroglycerin-like substance. And the other 90% is still water, because at the end of the day, he's still a human, so he's still going to send water through that system. So water is still going to be in his sweat. Bakugo's power-up would be changing that ratio from 1090 to something like 2080 or 3070 or 5050 even, to make sure that there's still some water in there, or maybe even to like 80-20, just ridiculously high ratios, so that you would go from focusing on the explosive quality, which is the straightforward idea that you get when you see a quirk named Explosion. Now looking at the distribution and utilization of the fact that it is actual sweat that explodes, paying attention to the physiological, and then finally getting all the way down to the makeup, if it's getting down to the chemical. All of these things, like if you think about it, the power up, people would see these as just pure power ups, but it's just him using his quirk how it should be, and him altering the purity of his sweat to also alter the amount of power and output is no different than a fire quirk user regulating the temperature of their flames so they have hotter or colder flames, and by colder, like less extremely hot fire. And that's what makes Gaten such an fascinating example, because it kind of highlights how outdated the Meta Liberation Army's ideology is more than anything. That Redestro still considers quirk awakening to be a thing, especially when you can look at Redestro's quirk and at a glance someone could say, oh, well, he awakened his quirk and took it a step further. And I would say, no, we just didn't take his power literally enough at first. He began with taking stress and then converting it into power. But what does power mean? Power as in energy, power as in physicality. Of course, we saw it as power and physicality because that's how he was able to use it. But then when you see burden, if you just take the phrase, stockpiling stress and converting it into power, that him being able to make a corporeal energy and throw it around isn't that crazy, because it's just stress being converted to power. It's another way of looking at the quirk, and some things might be harder to control and do than others, but that's no different than a quadruple somersault being harder than a jumping jack. Some things take more effort than others. And so with Redestro, he might see, oh yeah, well, I awakened my quirk, but really it's like, no, dude, you just got really good at it, and that's okay. And this comes with the fact that they have this over-reverent view of quirks, because let's be real, they call them meta-human abilities. And when you hear meta-human ability, you think of consistently useful powers. You do not think of things like Mr. I can stretch my eyeballs from Deku's class in middle school, or dude whose power was my fingers can extend a little bit. That's not what meta ability sounds. Meta ability sounds like what we have with Bakugo, like what we have with One for All, like what we have with Hot and Cold, like that's what meta ability brings to your mind, actual powers. And so they elevate quirks, and because they have quirks as this ideal on this ideal pedestal, they elevate what happens and how people utilize them as well. Now, and if you remember, before we get to the Geten example, if you remember, I said early in the series we covered what quirk awakening would be considered, which is using your quirk and understanding it differently. Like when somebody who thinks their quirk is manipulating water and shooting it from their body finds out that they are manipulating the water from the air. Like we talked about when Deku wanted to make costume upgrades all the way back in the first season. That is what people have been calling awakening, and it's purely because of the outdated mindset of the Meta Liberation Army. Because now, when we look at Geten, think about what I've said. If a fire user ups the temperature, nobody bats an eye. If an ice user says, I can make my ice colder, suddenly we freak out. But let's really think about that for a second, because of what Geten says himself. I control ice. All ice. If somebody says, I control flames, it's implied they can make their fire hotter. We don't get doubt that they can't generate more heat or bigger flames or anything like that. We never question that. We don't go, oh yeah, he's just soft locked into a flame of 525 degrees, never going to be higher than that, never going to be lower than that. That's exactly what that man is shooting. 525 every time, baby. Woo! We don't do that. So what is this? So when you think about it from that perspective, it's more like we have an extremely limited view on ice users, and even an ice user themselves is thinking, well, I move ice from A to B. They're not thinking about like, oh yeah, well, sometimes when ice is sitting in a bag, it starts to melt, but then that water hits each other, and then like the ice starts to refreeze because part of the ice towards the core, which is colder than the outside ice, and leads to the water that was dripping down to reaching back to freezing temperatures, now freezing it, and now your bag of ice, instead of being a bunch of individual ice cubes, is now kind of a mess, and then you have to like kind of break off chunks of the bag's ice. Yeah, y'all know what I'm talking about. So it's kind of like that. If just having ice sitting in a pile can lead to it regulating its own temperature and sometimes making certain parts refreeze, then why on earth would Geten not have been able to control the temperature of ice? What really happened is that Geten didn't realize that he could freeze things and lower their temperature. That's it. Just like Shigaraki spent years not thinking he could do the decaying propagation. How you see your quirk defines how you use it. Or determines how you use it, I should say. And when you see powers as one way, then you're going to use them that way only. And since Geten only saw his power as manipulating ice through movement and structure, and not through also temperature, the same way that somebody who's controlling the heat would do, he didn't do it until he really wanted to make something that was hot cold. When he actively desired to make something hot cold, he did it. He just never realized he could manipulate temperatures, and that's okay. If people are allowed to, and it's known that people sometimes misunderstand their quirks within verse, then it's reasonable to assume that nobody's quirk, which is already built into their DNA, is necessarily undergoing some massive change, unless you believe that quirks could potentially be aliens. But that's a topic for another video. So, quirk awakening, if you just look through all the examples, every single thing has a logical and basically like a physical biological aspect to it, that when you sit down and think about it and plug it in from like A to B, you kind of realize, oh yeah, this all tracks, and this actually doesn't require anything to change based on the description of the power that I've been given and the way it's impacted the characters' personalities throughout the series. So for example, Toga being a character who has always been in love with people and about love centered, having that current stipulation that because she can become the people and replicate the quirks of the people she's most attached to, we've seen that the entire time. Us getting that stipulation should make it make more sense to us. The Quirk power system is pretty well thought out, but it's also very simple in its thought process of, if this power does this, then you have to think about all of what that could mean. We might even find out that Bakugo can ignite other areas of his body. It's just that he's only ever really thought about doing it through his hands because that's how he thought it worked. If he hasn't actually really tried, we don't know. So that's something to consider. And remember, a jumping jack is easier than a quadruple somersault. So some of these people taking a longer time to figure out how to use their quirk makes sense. Endeavor, nobody's going to say Endeavor awakened his quirk now that he can do Prominence Burn and Flash Fire Fist Tail Spider at the same time. We just understand that he's gotten better at using it. And that's kind of what Quirk Awakening is. It's just being better. If anything, Quirk Awakening is the person awakening to the full scope of their quirk, as in coming to another understanding. And if you're wondering why Horikoshi would introduce this concept, it's moreover another bit of world building, another aspect to the beliefs and the ways he received quirks throughout history. And keep in mind, the rats theory may never come back into play, or it will come back into play. But if it doesn't, that doesn't mean it didn't add anything to the story, because it established and led Overhaul's ideology and how he approached things. And when you think about what I've said earlier, is that quirks are placed on this pedestal within the Meta Liberation Army. And you think about how Destro went from I'm the savior to painting Shigaraki as this messianic figure and immediately elevating him and praising him and worshiping him. Then you realize that because of his worship of quirks, because of his worship of the way Shigaraki's quirk influenced his personality, that all led to, by extension, him putting Shigaraki the person on the pedestal because of all those quirk factors. And the way that the Meta Liberation Army sees quirks as meta abilities. So when you have an entire philosophy oriented around quirk supremacy, then you have to also worship and have these ideas of them becoming better. Notice, through quirk, when you look at it as Quirk Awakening, the quirk is able to achieve something greater. If you just see it as a person understanding that a quirk is a tool or a piece of their body that they have to use better, quirks suddenly kind of become a lot more simple, even if they achieve complex things. So that wouldn't line up with the way they view things, but it would line up with the way the quirks have actually been implemented throughout the story the entire time that we've been reading it. And that would explain why it seems out of place when you really think about all the examples of awakening we've gotten on screen or on panel in comparison to what was allegedly happening with Gatan. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Just wanted to get this out there because my boy Bishop Ponzu had asked me to talk to y'all about this. Quirk Awakening has been one of those things that I've thought has kind of been bumpkies for a real long time now. So I'm just glad to know that, I'm just glad to get this out there. Hope you guys enjoy. Like, subscribe, leave a comment if you have any questions or you feel like arguing with the video or saying that, like, no matter what, Horikoshi wouldn't have introduced this concept or this phrase. But I like the idea of the world having built-in bad science. And by bad science, I just mean like things that are misinformation but are commonly held beliefs. It makes the world more realistic and adds flavor to the story, because unreliable narrators make plot structures more fascinating, for me at least, because you have to kind of piece together what's actually true versus what's more over their opinion. And it kind of adds a bit of flavor to the story to know that all these different perspectives exist. And that's kind of what makes the Todoroki plot so good too, is that we have all these perspectives, so we know that the truth isn't exactly all these things, and we have to figure out from there like what happened. And like Endeavor is still abusive; he's just not as big of a monster as we thought. When you factor in that he was also just trying to like not let Shoto be accidentally murdered again, stuff like that. It's important to have like a full contextualization. And with the fact that, you know, MVA even opens up with them taking on the creature rejection clan. So, you know, just I really appreciate when Horikoshi ties all these things together, foreshadows, like, you know, with the religious beliefs of the creature rejection clan, only for them to tackle another cult, etc., etc. So, yeah, I said I was supposed to be new in this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm Aniki. I'm out. Have a nice day. Hope to see you Sundays for the Church of MHA. If you're a One Piece fan, check out the One Piece content. If you're an MHA fan, there's plenty of content for you on this channel already. I'm out.